This abbreviated off-season California Zephyr has a mere 7 passenger carrying cars. From Keddie, we'll head eastbound and ride in the cab of a freight train to Portola. This steam engine tender almost made it over the edge here. Up ahead is a westbound freight. It's waiting for us and a siding. The second locomotive is a Union Pacific pooled unit. This was becoming a common sight in the 1970s, way before the UP announced in 1980 its intentions to merge the WP into the UP. This is Quincy Junction that connected to the 3.27-mile-long Quincy Railroad that served a lumber mill. The Quincy opened in 1917. It's owned by the Sierra Pacific Industries. WP and UP pooled cabooses before the merger. We resume our run to Portola over the trestle east of Quincy. This would be considered as great scenery if we weren't already spoiled by the Feather River scenery in the canyon. After we cross under Highway 70, our train will work its way up the Williams Loop. This railroad spiral was in keeping with the WP's 1% grade mandate. You can see the track above our location from here. This engineering strategy is reminiscent of the SP's loop on their Tehachapi line. We are now crossing over the short tunnel we've just passed through. A local behind a lone GP9 number 728 will run by us in the same direction of travel. On the back is caboose number 427, built in 1955. It was from a group of 35. Ahead is Spring Garden with its 4,630-foot long siding. Tunnel 35 is over 7,300 feet long, although we've shortened it a bit here. We've reached milepost 300. Notice the speed restrictions that are so prominent from about Polga to after Blairsden, where speeds go up to 40. This is Sloat that had a lumber mill associated with a mill back in Quincy. This is the Clio Viaduct at milepost 314.36. In another 7 miles, we will be in Portola, California. Today, the WP facilities in Portola are part of the Western Pacific Railroad Museum. The museum has an extensive collection of working locomotives and equipment and is open to the public from around April to October. Many of the things you have seen in this production have been preserved there, as if the WP has never really left us. Tunnel 36 is a short 763 feet in length. Now we cross and recross the river. When we reach Portola, we will be at milepost 321. The climb has us at 4,832 feet, with only 163 feet remaining. The peak at 4,995 feet is 18 miles ahead. A westbound California Zephyr pulls into Portola to make a scheduled stop. It will leave by 7:10 a.m. The trip through the Great Basin Desert was in darkness. The brushless cleaners will clean the dome car windows to remove dust picked up on the desert run and to better enjoy the scenery ahead in full daylight. It looks like they missed a few spots on our window. Passengers will enjoy breakfast in the scenery we've already run through going east, and by lunchtime they will be in Sacramento on their westbound trip. We're going back through the other end of Tunnel 36. We're on our way back westbound to experience the Williams Loop once again. First as a passenger, and then as a trackside viewer inside the loop near the tunnel portal. We will return to the WP main line and see some highlights on the way across the desert to Salt Lake City. This is the section the California Zephyr patrons missed. This has been a munitions depot since 1942. An eastbound CZ passenger would be here at 7:30 p.m. We've crossed into Nevada at Flanagan. This is where the SP Modoc line cuts into the WP. It saved eastbound SP trains many miles to run Modoc trains to a connection at Winnemucca. Here's the tie-in point. These scenes are long before any locomotives had air conditioning. Temperatures here in the summer could be fatiguing. The unending click-clack of jointed track could eventually numb one's attention. Distant mountain ranges never seemed to get larger, and time seemed to stand still. We've reached Gerlach, Nevada at milepost 438. U.S. Gypsum has a plant here that generated a lot of business for the WP. Winnemucca is a crew change point. Our train will stop to change crews after waiting for an earlier arrival to leave with their fresh crew. The SP and WP had shared tracks between a point near Winnemucca all the way out to a point near Wells. This dates back to World War I. The WP line was assigned eastbound traffic, and the SP line was assigned westbound traffic. The SP and WP tracks run together. The brick Elko depot on the left was built in 1959. It has been torn down, and just about everything else here looks far different today. The grade crossings have all been eliminated. Trains can run through here now at higher speeds. Just past the tiny community of Deeth, the paired tracks pass under I-80. At Olazon on the way to Wells, Nevada, the SP and WP had a crossover just before the paired tracks split up. We crossed the Nevada Northern tracks at Shafter, Nevada. This westbound with UP power and caboose is a WP train with pooled power. We encounter more rock slide detection fencing through cuts, even out here in the desert. After crossing the state line into Utah and passing Windover, we're in Blair, milepost 808.7. We are now on the 8th subdivision. This is the edge of the Bonneville Salt Flats. It's so vast and flat here, you can see the curvature of the earth. This is aragonite, Utah, named after the calcium carbonate mineral. This is milepost 868.8 near Marblehead, Utah. Once we cross under I-80, around 4,630 feet, the tracks begin descending down to the Salt Lake level of 4,200 feet. Down below, this was filmed after a snow along the southern edge of the Great Salt Lake near Stansbury Bay. The Salt Lake region once was called the Crossroads of the West, supporting 4 major railroads. The green track is the WP, the red SP, orange Rio Grande, yellow is the UP. By 1996, it all became UP trackage. At milepost 926, we're approaching West 200 South with the power plant visible on the other side of I-80. Off in the distance are the snow-covered Wasatch Mountains. It's just one of the reasons to travel here to the Greater Salt Lake region. Long ago, the WP tied up in Roper Yard after passing by the Union Pacific. The WP worked with the Rio Grande for connections east of here.
The Alcos would soon be replaced by EMD-F units due to reliability problems with the Alco diesel and turbocharging system. The train we're on is Alco-powered, but the meet with the opposite CZ brings all EMD power, as the crews from each train exchange greetings. The Rio Grande's Salt Lake City was a fine destination in its own right, with a city visited by many for the lake, nearby mountains, and a city with its own attractions. The Rio Grande Salt Lake Station was a grand but somewhat overbuilt monument from the George Gould days of often misplaced extravagance. As we leave the station, we'll look at the CZ map and see how the westbound trip was scheduled to allow daylight travel in the most scenic areas. The Rio Grande ride was almost all daylight, being the shortest segment of the trip. Notice the distance traveled on the Burlington route in darkness compared to the Western Pacific, and you'll have a better idea of the CB&Q's ability of running fast trains. In the planning days of the CZ, the CB&Q was the senior planner, and its credit rating helped underwrite the plan. The Q was experienced at running trains efficiently and with high track speeds. The Q served two demanding parents, namely the Northern Pacific and Great Northern, with St. Paul to Chicago connections. Their own Twin Cities train also had connecting service with the Northern Pacific and Great Northern cars, such as these, tacked on the end. The CB&Q kept their track up to support speed, safety, and comfort, and was never guilty of the deferred maintenance so common in the 60s. The competition for business in their territory was fierce due to too many railroads and too much track built in the 19th century. The passenger train was becoming a burden by 1960, but the CB&Q carried it well, supporting mail and even commuter trains in one of the busiest rail areas of the country. The CB&Q was the dependable anchor for the California Zephyr and was capable of making up for lost time on many an eastbound Zephyr. That long Denver to Chicago run wasn't especially scenic, but you could count on the Q's partnership in those 21 years. Partnerships weren't unusual. The wealthy Union Pacific used the Wabash into Chicago for several trains. UP also partnered with the SP on the city of San Francisco. The SP and the Rock Island jointly ran the Golden State, to mention a few. However, the partnership remembered best was the California Zephyr, and the Western Pacific is the first vision that comes to mind when people remember America's most talked about train. The speediest part of the trip was on the CB&Q's fast main line, searing through the more ordinary scenery and darkness. The war's end reawakened the interest in the California Zephyr. It would take 4 more years before the train would operate over the CB&Q, the Rio Grande, and the Western Pacific, but it was the last word in Zephyr lore, and it would be worth the wait. We leave the scenic San Francisco Bay Area at 10 a.m. running down the old streets of Oakland and on the WP's tracks. The WP was a latecomer to the West, opened by 1910 and built mostly with money from the Gould Empire that owned the other partner of the California Zephyr, the Rio Grande. The Western Pacific had the Feather River Canyon route that was the main draw over the 928 miles to Salt Lake City in Utah. The Zephyr continued through the Nevada desert and western Utah during the night to arrive in Salt Lake City, Utah. The passengers in the tail-end dome observation car had the premium view, with a bar for Pullman passengers, and a quick climb up the staircase brought the famous dome car view of scenery. The Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad bridged the Zephyr to the CB&Q in Denver, Colorado. The Zephyr's menu included fresh brook trout, prime steak, and dishes associated with the regions the train traveled through. Dome seats were unreserved and unsold seats and provided for all passengers, coach and Pullman alike. In the summer, the Rio Grande's ride included sunlight all the way to Denver, Colorado. The California Zephyr left in darkness from Denver to run 1,034 miles to Chicago. This was the fastest part of the trip, and patrons would arrive in Chicago by 2 p.m. the next afternoon. To better show the experience of leaving Denver eastbound, we'll hop on a different train. These views of the CB&Q Denver Zephyr to Chicago at the dawn of Amtrak's era in 1971 give a few glimpses of late afternoon light. The Denver Zephyr was equipped much like the California Zephyr. The gleaming stainless steel cars and the silver E9s pulling up front were the influence of Ralph Budd of the CB&Q. The original California Zephyr's 3 railroad partners purchased the cars to support 6 10-car trains. The trains expanded to 13 cars with rising popularity. They all carried the California Zephyr name above the windows and reporting marks of each road at the car's ends. The 2,500-mile Zephyr run took 2.5 days total, and it was conceived from the start as a sightseeing experience. It could compete with air travel with this edge, and the 2.5 days could still compare favorably with auto travel. It offered more comfort than both, and passengers would arrive at either end of the system refreshed and in good spirits. This strategy worked until the 60s and the expanded interstate highway system, and with the arrival of jet air travel. The cost of operation began to exceed revenues, and the equipment was getting older. The increased maintenance strongly suggested purchasing all new equipment. All these factors were a burden that fell the hardest on the Western Pacific. The WP was the first to realize the inevitable, and the ICC allowed discontinuance in 1970. On March 22nd, the Ralph Budd-inspired California Zephyr tied up for the last time. The California Zephyr experience lasted 20 years. Racing down the CB&Q's hot main line towards Chicago shows a well-maintained and operated line. When the California Zephyr began operation on March 20th, 1949, Ralph Budd was retiring. Budd's Q was the strongest of the California Zephyr operators, and it had the most influence on the train's conception, design, and operation from the start. The Q had the better financial history and solid backing. This greatly helped to drive the project when it started after the war. Everyone would miss the California Zephyr, even the ones that never quite purchased tickets. Its passing was symbolic of some problems that were beginning to turn the rail industry upside down, and it would take several decades and even government changes in laws to sort out. The 77 California Zephyr cars built by the Budd Corporation were larger and more refined versions of the original Zephyrs. They shared the same strong 18-8 stainless steel construction. 18-8 is steel with 18% chromium and 8% nickel added for toughness and corrosion resistance. The Zephyr cars all had the word silver in the car names to remind the public that they were riding something special. The CB&Q Denver Zephyr continued all the way into the Amtrak era in 1971, with the CB&Q itself already immersed in the Burlington Northern merger of 1970. The clean window policy was a standard that all the James Hill lines promoted, and this car scrubber demonstrates the equipment. The railroad industry was changing again, and over the next 20 years there would be a lot of service changes, mergers, and even collapses. The increasing labor costs eventually were 70% above the original costs. The train was all state-of-the-art in 1949, but by the late 60s the equipment was worn and difficult to maintain in the standards the train deserved. Back in Oakland at Middle Harbor Road, the eastbound Zephyr number 18 is preparing for its journey. The WP had trouble from the beginning with steam heating capacity in its F units. Eventually, longer trains and aging boilers forced WP to buy steam heater cars, such as this Great Northern example. These were painted to look like locomotives rather than break up the passenger car's stainless steel look. The baggage car is a standard CB&Q unit, and several other cars are non-CZ in this train. That was usually avoided, but in later years, equipment shortages and seasonally longer trains forced the compromise. This train has 5 dome coaches, plus the tail observation dome for a total of 6. 1965 was the last year of any profit for the CZ. Each year thereafter, the losses became higher. Of the 3 partners, the losses were hardest on the WP. The old idea was to sell luxury, not speed. Trips through the Feather River Canyon usually hovered around 30 miles an hour, a nice sightseeing speed. On a full Zephyr, 150 of the 250 passengers held coach tickets. It became a tough sell to convince patrons that a 2-night sleep in a coach seat was a luxury trip. As mere basic transportation, the train could only fail. Overall, the CZ had a fine near 80% occupancy record. That would have made many other roads happy. However, there remained the issue that the train only held 250 patrons total per trip. Larger crowds, like true cruise ships, may have made a difference in the economy of scale. We'll never know. The WP was the first of the 3 partners to file for discontinuance. The most reluctant was the CB&Q. If you rank the 3 partners by gross income, you can see why the WP came to the conclusion first. It was lower ranked in total income than the Rio Grande, and it had a longer part of the Zephyr run. The disasters of snowstorms, floods, slides, and expensive wrecks that fell on WP in 1969 were the final blows. A good company was now fully in the red, and the passenger train was a luxury it could no longer afford. WP had put everything required into the train to keep it first class, but it was time to quit. The last full Zephyr ran on March 22, 1970. These scenes on the Rio Grande are a reminder that it took 2 other great railroads to put something together as worthwhile as the California Zephyr. The CB&Q had always been a stable and strong railroad. But the Rio Grande, like the WP, had spent decades and several bankruptcies to work its way into a well-run road. Neither could afford running passenger service as things had been for much longer, but their response to the matter had some differences. The great stations across the U.S. were becoming ghost-like, and it was still a year to wait for the partial rescue with the forming of Amtrak. There was one consolation for Zephyr rail fans. The Rio Grande would keep their section of the train running against all odds. The CB&Q ran their passenger service for another year until Amtrak started in 1971. The Q had become part of the huge BN merger. The Rio Grande had no interest running Amtrak trains on its mountainous freight hauling tracks. The Grande carried its then tri-weekly Zephyr from Denver to Salt Lake for 13 more years. The California Zephyr served its purpose for those 21 years. The WP as well as the Rio Grande had built themselves into very good railroads. Their performance as freight carriers was now assumed good, in part because of their performance as passenger haulers. It had been worth the effort. The Rio Grande Zephyr was coach only, but it sometimes carried 5 dome cars and maintained a full dining car, just as if nothing had changed. It carried the tradition of America's most talked about train.